So when I found I was going to talk in the habit section of today's Fit Talks, I rewrote my entire talk. And one of the things that I think when I think about habits these are the things that we automatically do, things that we create a very low barrier of entry to do every day. Ideally, these are things that we don't think about doing, right? We just do them automatically. So they're not things that require conscious thought, they're things that we can do without thinking. And we do lots of things without thinking. Generally, they're things that are not good for us. So if we can start to build good things in our life that we can do without thinking, then you start to gain momentum and you can snowball the changes in your life, and that's really where the magic happens. I think that a lot of times, especially now, there's so much information. Like when I got started and I got into nutrition through fitness and through bodybuilding, I don't want to sound really old, but the internet didn't really exist. It existed, but not really, right? And I could buy Muscle and Fitness magazine. It came out once a month, and I could read, whatever was in that. And that was basically the extent of what I was able to get. But now we have so many choices. And sometimes with too much choice, we then don't end up taking deliberate and sustained action because we're jumping from different things. Or we end up just thinking too much about our choices and end up with no choice. And the only way that nutrition really works, yes, I'm going to talk about some things that when you eat certain foods in a certain way, it has a relatively immediate effect on your biology. But what I would always tell my clients is, especially from a weight loss perspective, is that my goal isn't to help you lose weight because chances are you've done that in the past. But I'd like us to never have to have this same conversation again. That we could make changes in your life, and you can work to make changes in your life, and that those changes are sustaining. So in 20 years, you're not dealing or trying to solve this exact same problem, because it's the compounding effects of good quality food over time that really unlock the potential for our health and allow us, when we get to this point later in life, where we can really do all the things that we want. So what I want to do today is talk about this 30-10 standard for leveling up your nutrition in a single meal. And I'll tell you kind of a little story about how I got into the habit area. It was 2013. This is a picture of a gym that was in Manhattan called Peak Performance. I was a couple years done with my PhD. The guy who ran this gym, his name was Joe Dowdell. We became really good friends. Joe emailed me out of nowhere and was like, hey, I've read one of your books. I'd love to have you come to the gym, talk about how we could do some things together. We don't really have anybody doing nutrition at the gym. Peak Performance dealt with kind of the top tier clientele in New York City. So it was a lot of finance people, it was models, it was professional athletes, and I was living in Pennsylvania. I just finished my PhD, so I was living in central Pennsylvania. I had 3 kids under 4, and my wife was like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm going to drive to New York City and meet this guy from the internet, and he wants to talk about some work that I could do. And she's like, well, I don't know if that sounds like a good idea, but go ahead. So I hop in my minivan, drive to Jersey City, try not to get mugged, take the path into Manhattan, right, find my way to Peak Performance. And so Joe and I ended up start talking, and we really hit it off. And then so for a lot of years, twice a month, I would drive into New York City, sleep on his couch, and I would counsel people at Peak Performance. And it really put me, I was dealing with, all kinds of people, people that you couldn't help them with their nutrition unless they came to you and they were like, hey, I need help. And so I kind of stepped into the stream of this really interesting set of clientele. And so one day, he calls me and he's like, hey, we have this guy who comes in, and this guy was, arguably top 5 most influential people in technology, in the world. And he's like, he needs some nutrition help. Can you make a special trip to the city? I was like, obviously, and meet with him and let's talk. So I'm thinking, I'm pulling out all the PhD stuff, right? I'm gonna let this guy know that I'm the right one because I know everything. And so we sit down and I'm talking through, I'm like, well, you gotta do this, and I think we should do this and this. And he's like, that's not really an option. He's like, we have to make it simpler. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And he goes, well, let me tell you this way. After I leave here, I'm gonna go to the UN. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I don't know who I'm talking to. and I don't know where exactly it is. But I'll get in a car, and they'll take me there, and they'll give me a presentation, and then I'll do it. He goes, I don't know what's going on next and what's happening next in my life. He had 3 assistants that ran 24 hours a day. And so I need something simpler. And he said, I need something that's going to directly impact my food choices. I'm making bad food choices. And part of what was interesting about this guy was he would go out to eat and people were like, oh, it's, so-and-so. And so the chef would try to make, like me, it was like the chef version of me, like I'm gonna give him the best. So the chef would make this amazing meal, and imagine if like every chef you met was trying to make you the most decadent food you could ever imagine, like you'd get diabetes pretty quick, right? Like it's just hard. And so he needed to figure out, how can I just make better choices, and didn't have the mental bandwidth to think about things. So he's like, well, what's the framework for making choices? And I would say, well, let's do this. And he'd be like, too complicated, let's make it simpler. I'm like, well, how about we do this? Too complicated, make it simpler. So then we kind of got it down really basic. He goes, well, is this advice you'd give everyone? I'm like, well, we've basically distilled it down to like, eat, right? So yeah, like I would give this advice to pretty much everyone. And we though still have we have all these choices now. Right? What's driving our food choices at the most basic level? And so up here, you have a variety of different kind of theories or philosophies on how you could eat, right? I'm going to cut carbs, I'm going to eat based on whether it's processed or not processed, count macronutrients, glycemic load, dietary guidelines if anybody does that, intuitive eating, follow a vegan diet, and eventually, like all of these will get you from A to B, right? Like if you do any of these things and you are, religious about it, like you'll get to A to B. It might not be the perfect way because maybe you picked the wrong thing for you, but you could get there. But this is also all still kind of complicated if we think about making habits. Because macros is like super complicated, but let's say energy density, which is, you can think of that as basically the amount of calories per bite in food. So it's like the grams of the food weight and then the calories. And so if you get a lot of calories for not a lot of grams, that means you're gonna eat a lot of that food, right? Because we actually eat, humans, this is really crazy, humans don't eat based on calories, infants eat based on calories, but sometime between infancy and young adolescence, like being a toddler almost actually, we lose the ability to sense caloric intake. And we eat based on weight. 3.5 pounds a day of food is what we kind of eat. Some people a little more, some people a little less. That 3.5 pounds could be 1,500 calories, could be 6,000 calories, but we're basically gonna eat this based on weight. What's crazy is when they do this stuff with the infants, they'll give them the same volume of food, but they'll manipulate the amount of calories in the liquid, and the infants will stop sucking on the bottle once they've hit a certain calorie level if the researchers manipulate that. We eat for a lot of other reasons other than calories, so we lose that ability to sense. So we eat based on weight. So we need some other things that could guide our food choices. So that's where this idea, 30-10 as your kind of nutritional standard, which would be 30 grams of protein, 10 grams of fiber, and you want to start your day doing this at breakfast, right? Mike was just talking about starting your day the right way has huge implications on the rest of your day. And I think nutritionally, the same is true. And I'm going to show you there's actually some cool biochemistry that also says the same thing is true. So if you're thinking, how do I start, like where do I start with nutrition? Nutrition is very confusing. Where do I start? You could start right here, and there's going to be some amazing downstream effects. And there's also a lot of flexibility in how you get 30 grams of protein and 10 grams of fiber. So this is kind of how the average American eats. Researchers call it a skewed protein distribution. So very little bit amount of protein at breakfast, a little bit more at lunch, and then a large protein dinner. So this skewed distribution. Now the problem though is, on food choices aside, right, because I want to give you a bunch of options and you can basically choose the foods that you like. Food choices aside, eating only 11 grams of protein, it doesn't meet our needs for a meal, and it also doesn't meet our needs early in the day. We want to shoot for about 30 grams of protein, and it's a couple reasons. Sometimes you'll hear that 30 grams is the most that you can consume or digest in one meal. I used to work with this guy who was 7'2". He was a professional basketball player. He was like 275 in season, 300 pounds in the off season. Like if he only ate 30 grams of protein at every meal, like it wouldn't have really worked out, right? So fortunately, the body is pretty elastic on size and it scales on size. But what it is with protein and 30 grams is you need enough to basically turn on the switch in your body at the cellular level that says, let's start building and repairing muscle. And 30 grams is the most basically to maximize that switch, like a light switch. Like when the light switch is on, it's on all the way. And 30 grams gets it on all the way. And that's gonna be maximizing the signals that allow for muscle building and muscle repair. The 30 grams though, from a fullness perspective, so one of the other cool things about protein is that it also makes us feel full. And that's what researchers will call satiety. But that satiety, that satiating effect, starts at about 30 grams and then goes up from there. So if you eat 50 grams, it's more filling. If you eat 60 grams, those signals are even more filling. Now, maybe there'll be some people in this crowd. I tried this on a group of dietitians once. It didn't go over very well. When I was talking about this dose-response effect of satiety, I was like, well, anybody who's ever tried to eat a whole rotisserie chicken knows this, right? Because by the time you get to the second chicken breast, you're like, how am I gonna eat these 2 chicken thighs? It's like, nobody. So, dietitians in Illinois do not try to eat full rotisserie chickens. But you'll know this if you ever sit down to eat a lot of protein, like it gets significantly, not just the volume of food, but it's very satiating. And it does this because protein actually manipulates your brain in a couple really cool ways. So you actually have one hormone in your body that increases hunger, and that's ghrelin. Ghrelin's released by your stomach. There's a lot of cool things about ghrelin. It's got a cool nickname. Sometimes people call it the hunger gremlin. But when you eat protein, ghrelin is gonna decrease. So it decreases these active hunger signals. The other thing that protein does is in a variety of parts of your digestive system, it also releases other compounds. Now, generally people will look at this and like, oh, Mike just made up a bunch of letters and stuck them together. But actually now, like maybe GLP-1 might sound familiar because that's like Ozempic, that's the weight loss drug that is in all the news all the time, is a GLP-1 agonist. So it's like mimics GLP-1. It's not like, I'm not saying, eat protein at every meal and you're gonna lose 17% of your body weight in 6 weeks, like Ozempic, but I'm just saying it works along those same mechanisms. They're released from the digestive system, travels up to your brain, and then you feel fuller. So, I'm going way over, so I gotta go really quick here. The other cool thing about protein and why it's so important at breakfast is it actually impacts how your brain functions later in the day. So I have a friend who used to be at Purdue, and now she's down at the University of Texas in Austin. And they gave people protein at breakfast, or they gave them a small amount of protein at breakfast. And then they did functional MRIs later in the day. They showed them the pictures of either appetizing food or things that were appealing but not appetizing. So for this crowd, crawling around in the mud, appealing but not appetizing, right? And so then they said, well, what happens to your brain when that happens? And to the people who had a high protein breakfast, the reward centers in their brain did not light up as much when they saw cakes, cookies, pies, French fries, etc. So protein at breakfast actually dampens your brain's response to hyperpalatable foods later in the day, which is crazy if you think about like eating something at 7 a.m. and that impacts how your brain's gonna like process other foods 8 hours later. Okay, so so this is what you want to do, protein stacking. I don't know, I'm gonna get through this in a minute. Here's your list of proteins. I would take a picture of this. Protein at breakfast is difficult because other meals you say, oh, I'm gonna eat a chicken breast, and that's gonna give you 30 grams of protein. But at breakfast, you kind of gotta stack them together from a bunch of different sources to get 30 grams, but it's not too hard, right? So you can have 2 eggs, glass of milk, handful of pistachios, your 30 grams of protein. And you stack them together, and other research shows that getting protein from a variety of sources actually increases and improves satiety later in the day. So a little bit about carbohydrates in 2 minutes or less. So we have a carb problem, and here's our carb problem. It's not necessarily that we're eating carbohydrates, it's just these are the carbohydrates we're eating. So we eat on average about 54% of our calories from carbohydrates. only 9% of those are what we would consider quality carbohydrates. Only 5% of the population gets enough fiber every day. So if you're a math person, that's about 25 grams for women, 36 grams for men. So the recommendation would be eat whole grains, which I think is like the most confusing advice I've ever heard in my whole life, because all these foods are whole grains, right? Trust me, I know, because my kids keep reminding me. So 78% of people eat whole grains in order to increase their fiber intake, but only 7% of the fiber that we eat comes from whole grain products. So there's this big disconnect between what we're trying to do and what we're actually getting in our diets. So a couple other things on carbohydrates. I call this ideas worth ignoring. Complex carbohydrates. It's actually a chemical description of the carbohydrate structure. It has nothing to do with how the carbohydrates impact your bloodstream. So maltodextrin it's in a lot of post-workout shakes, post-workout products, right? It's not a sugar, it's technically a complex carbohydrate. Gets into your bloodstream faster than pretty much any other carbohydrate you could think of. So just because it's a complex carbohydrate, like it sounds good, but it doesn't impact your biology very well. Glycemic index, not applicable to the real world because it's standardized on eating 50 grams of carbohydrates. Like you're not gonna sit down and eat 50 grams of carrots generally, right? So that doesn't work in the real world. Glycemic load, which takes into account glycemic index plus amount, requires you to have at least a master's degree in math to read a food label, so that's not really good either. So instead, let's just look at fiber, because fiber and carbohydrate quality are tightly linked together. We can place this emphasis on dietary fiber, not functional fiber. And you're like, okay, well, what are those things? Here's the simple test. Flip the food over, look at the nutrition facts panel. If there are fibers that have multiple syllables in the ingredient list that you don't understand, those are functional fibers. They don't count as much, because what we want with dietary fiber is the fiber that's actually in the food, like the fiber that's in brown rice or in potatoes or in raspberries. Why this works so well is when you eat quality carbohydrates, the red dots, early in the day, when you have your second meal, you have better blood sugar control afterwards. So it's called the second meal effect, and if you say, I skip breakfast, and then you have the second meal, eating quality carbohydrates at breakfast still gives you a better blood sugar control profile for your second meal. All right, last thing, here's how you want to think about fiber. These are some just common things, common foods, the amount of fiber in them. So you can start, piece together 10 grams of fiber. Now, I know there was a lot of numbers and a bunch of graphs, and you'll probably forget all those things. So I want you to remember 30-10, and I want you to remember this. Focus on the numbers just so it starts bringing awareness to what you're eating. What does 30 grams of protein look like? What foods give me 10 grams of carbohydrates? So start gaining awareness. Then create layup meals. What are meals that you know you can have and are gonna deliver you those? So for me, wild blueberries, flaxseed, a little pistachios, scoop of protein powder, checks all the boxes. When I'm in a pinch, I know I can make that very quickly. Create these layup meals in your life. And then transition to patterning. So dietary patterns, the kinds of foods that you eat. You can look at those food lists that I had up there and think, what are the kinds of foods that are gonna get me 30 grams of protein and 10 grams of fiber, right? You don't need to worry about the grams once you have the patterning down. Once you're able to nail this at breakfast, start applying it to the other meals of the day. It's gonna make your diet a lot healthier. It's gonna make you feel a lot better, but really leverage those habits. Thank you guys so much.